Inside the marble-lit Capitol Civic Center in Washington, D.C., rising public icon Sasha Obama stepped into thunderous applause, hailed as a symbol of Gen Z activism and poise. But just 4 minutes later, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, armed with a sealed dossier and an unshakable resolve, shattered the ceremony, revealing explosive evidence of a 2022 cover-up directly implicating Sasha. What began as a night of celebration turned into a national reckoning, unraveling layer by layer under the weight of truth, guilt, and privilege. Was Sasha Obama truly a beacon of progress, or the polished product of elite protection pushed too far? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Inside the vaulted marble hall of the Capitol Civic Center, banners bearing the logo of Voices Forward fluttered under harsh white lights. Founded by Michelle Obama in her post-White House years, the nonprofit had become a cultural behemoth, celebrating youth empowerment, female leadership, and digital influence. But tonight, the air buzzed with a different charge. Sasha Obama, hailed by the event as a voice of her generation, was the headliner. Introduced as a beacon of Gen Z positivity, she walked onto the stage with a calm poise, bathed in soft blue spotlights and thunderous applause. Her social media clips, filtered and elegant, played behind her. Snippets of spoken-word poetry, climate awareness, and feminist solidarity. Yet below the surface, unease crept like a virus. Because in the fourth row sat Jasmine Crockett, a civil rights attorney turned congresswoman, her gaze fixed like steel on the stage. She had publicly condemned this very event last month, calling it a glorified influencer gala bankrolled by silent privilege. And now she was in the building. The press called it a powerful reunion of two Black female leaders. But Jasmine knew better. She didn't come for photo ops or sound bites. She came because something about this entire production didn't sit right. The scripted speeches, the curated praise, the unchallenged elevation of personalities over principle, everything reeked of performance. As applause roared again when Sasha smiled and waved, Jasmine didn't move. Her eyes didn't blink. In a room designed to celebrate harmony, she felt only pressure. Pressure to stay silent, pressure to conform, pressure to pretend. But Jasmine had never been good at pretending. She had spent her career tearing off polished veneers, and as she sat there, jaw set, breath held, she knew one thing for certain. This night wasn't going to go as planned. As Sasha stood on that stage soaking in applause, Jasmine sat stone still in the fourth row, because locked inside her briefcase wasn't just skepticism, it was a secret the world had never been allowed to hear. The envelope arrived quietly. No name, no return address, no stamps. Just her name on the front. It was left on her office desk like a whisper that dared to speak. Jasmine didn't open it for 3 days. She had seen her share of anonymous messages before. Most were fake, full of drama and lies. But something about this one felt different. Heavy, cold. Like it had been sent by someone who wasn't trying to get attention, but trying to tell the truth. When she finally opened it, her hands shook. Inside there were police documents, traffic photos, and something worse, a death certificate. It was from Los Angeles, dated July 18, 2022, 3:14 a.m. A man had been hit by a car and died instantly. His name, Luis Alberto Mendez, 36 years old. The report said he was a construction worker, walking home after a night shift. He had no family nearby, no lawyer, no papers. He was undocumented. The street was dark, no traffic lights, no signs, no cameras, except one. 4 grainy images were included. In the first, a black car entered the frame. In the second, headlights lit up a figure. In the third, that figure fell backward. In the fourth, only red taillights remained. The car had never stopped. Jasmine kept reading. A federal memo was included. Parts of it were blacked out, but she could still read words like public figure, no charges, and closed at the federal level. A letter from a powerful law firm in Washington followed. It didn't mention names. It just recommended quiet resolution to protect legacy and reputation. Jasmine had heard that tone before. In court, in politics. It was how people with power spoke when they wanted someone to disappear without a mess. But the worst part wasn't the reports. It was a small, torn piece of notebook paper stuck in the back. It had just one sentence, written in shaky handwriting. She was the one behind the wheel. No name, no explanation. But Jasmine didn't need one. Every file, every photo, every word pointed in one direction. Someone had killed that man, and someone else had made sure it never became a headline. Louis was poor. He was undocumented. He was invisible. And that made it easy for the system to pretend his life didn't matter. Jasmine sat in silence for a long time. Her heart pounded. Her hands were ice cold. But her mind was clear. This wasn't a traffic accident. It was a decision. A decision to protect someone with status by erasing someone without it. And if no one else would speak for Louis, she would. Loudly, publicly, even if it meant burning bridges with the most powerful names in the country. Because this wasn't just injustice, it was silence. Paid for and protected. And she had no intention of letting it stand. She hadn't planned to speak, not that night, but sitting there, folder pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. Watching applause drown out the truth, Jasmine knew. If she stayed silent now, she'd be just another part of the cover-up. She stood up slowly, not with fanfare, not with fury, just steady, with purpose. Her heels clicked once, twice against the marble floor as she moved into the center aisle. The heavy folder clutched tightly in her hand. Heads turned. Phones were lifted. A few aides leaned forward, sensing something was off, but too late. Jasmine didn't wait for a mic. She walked straight toward the stage where the host was still smiling awkwardly, mid-sentence. His voice faltered when he saw her. The room wasn't built for interruption, but Jasmine's presence didn't ask for space. It took it. She stepped onto the stage and turned to face the crowd. No one stopped her. No one dared, because something in her face told them this wasn't a political stunt. This was the beginning of something they didn't yet understand, but couldn't look away from. She raised the folder just enough so the cameras could see it. Her voice was clear, calm, deadly calm. Before we continue honoring legacies and rewriting headlines, she said, I have a question. Her gaze swept the room. No one breathed. Why is this woman, she continued, nodding slightly toward Sasha, being celebrated as a symbol of justice when she's never once been asked to answer for her past? The words weren't loud, but they cut through the silence like a blade. Every spotlight in the hall suddenly felt too bright, every seat too small. Sasha didn't move. Her face froze, not shocked, not angry, just hollow, like she knew this moment had always been waiting. Jasmine stepped closer to the podium, her tone tightening. We tell young people that truth matters, that accountability matters, but here we are, applauding someone who has never been held to the same standard as everyone else in this room, simply because her last name makes people nervous. A low murmur began in the back. Organizers whispered to each other, motioning toward security, but Jasmine didn't stop. She pointed to the folder. This is not rumor. This is not drama. This is what justice looks like when it's ignored, redacted, and buried. And tonight, I won't let that happen quietly. She lowered the folder, but her voice stayed sharp. We all know what this room was supposed to be. But if we want it to mean something, really mean something, then we have to stop pretending that influence is innocence. Sasha sat motionless. Her fingers gripped the edge of her chair so tightly her knuckles went pale. She didn't speak. Not yet. Not a word. Around her, the room held its breath, frozen between the story they'd come to celebrate and the truth that had just walked on stage and shattered it. The silence after Jasmine's accusation wasn't empty. It was thick, heavy, like the seconds before a building gives way. And in that stillness, all eyes turned to Sasha, waiting for the woman they'd come to celebrate to finally speak, not as a symbol, but as a human being under fire. Sasha stood, slowly, every movement deliberate, like someone trying not to step on glass. Her breath was steady, but her eyes gave her away. They weren't defiant. They were calculating, searching the crowd, measuring the moment, preparing the version of herself that could survive this. She walked toward the edge of the stage where the podium still stood. where Jasmine had planted her folder like a declaration of war. Sasha didn't touch it. She stood beside it, keeping her hands locked together in front of her. No microphone was needed. The room was quiet enough to hear the soft click of her heels when she shifted weight. "I want to respond," she began. Her voice was calm, measured, but behind every syllable was a strain, like someone holding up a mask made of glass, hoping it wouldn't crack. "I've stayed quiet for a reason. I've spent years being followed, photographed, assumed. I've had things said about me that were half true, twisted, or entirely made up. But I didn't come here to argue with anyone." She turned slightly to face Jasmine, not with aggression, but with controlled civility. "What happened on July 18th, 2022 was tragic. But I wasn't driving. I was a passenger in the vehicle that night. The driver left the scene, yes, but I didn't." There it was, the line, the boundary, the carefully measured truth. Legal enough to sound right, vague enough to leave room for doubt. She let it settle into the room. Let the tension bend under the weight of her calm. "I didn't lie," she added. "I didn't hide anything. I gave a statement. I cooperated. I trusted the process." But Jasmine didn't move, didn't blink. The tension in her jaw didn't release. The crowd might have paused, might have questioned their certainty for a moment. But Jasmine hadn't come with speculation. She had come with proof. "Trusted the process," Jasmine echoed under her breath, just loud enough to be heard. Then louder. "What process? The one that closes files when it sees a famous last name? The one that leaves a body in the street and no arrest report on record?" Sasha didn't answer. She stood still, silent again. Jasmine stepped forward, not aggressively, but with the same sharp stillness she had carried since the first word left her mouth. She didn't look at Sasha now. She looked at the room. She turned her body just enough so the audience and cameras could see her clearly, then gestured to the screen behind them. The massive LED panel that had, minutes earlier, played Sasha's award montage. She nodded toward the technician at the edge of the stage. "Can you cue the file marked Exhibit 1? There was a long pause. A tech worker hesitated, looking back and forth between the producer and a woman wearing a headset near the press box. But Jasmine's voice cut through their confusion. "Do it." A few seconds passed. Then the screen flickered. The lights dimmed. The room grew darker, not just physically, but emotionally, like something sacred was about to be breached. The video began with a timestamp, July 18th, 2022, 3:13:47 a.m. Sepulveda Boulevard / West 99th, Los Angeles. No audio, just grainy black and white footage from a stationary home security camera across the street. It showed a quiet residential block, dimly lit, trash bins lined along the curb. Nothing moved until, at 3:13:54, a dark luxury vehicle slid into frame from the right. It slowed at the corner, then coasted to a stop by the curb. A long 7 seconds passed. Then the driver's side door opened. A figure stepped out, female, tall, wearing a jacket over a tank top. One hand adjusting her hair, the other resting briefly on the roof of the car. The frame zoomed slightly. It was her, Sasha Obama. Not the passenger side, not the back seat, the driver's side. She paused in the middle of the frame, glancing around quickly, then turned her head away from the camera and walked toward the sidewalk, out of frame. No one else exited the car. The timestamp ran on for 20 more seconds. Then the screen froze. Sasha's image, crystal clear in that final still, hung above them like a ghost. No one in the room moved. No one had to, because there was nothing left to say. Jasmine turned this time to face Sasha directly. Her voice was quiet, but each word dropped like stone. "You weren't in the passenger seat. You stepped out of the driver's side, alone. You looked around. You left before police arrived. That's not an opinion. That's not politics. That's video. That's fact." Sasha didn't speak. Her eyes were wide, her mouth just slightly open. Not in panic, but in that hollow numbness that comes right before panic hits. Jasmine didn't push further. She didn't need to. The room was doing the work now, processing, recalibrating, reevaluating every word Sasha had spoken just moments earlier. A murmur rose from the press section. Whispers turned into typing, typing into headlines. Jasmine looked back at the crowd, not with triumph, not with spite, but with a kind of sorrow, a weariness that came from knowing she hadn't wanted this. She had hoped Sasha would tell the truth, had hoped the system would do the right thing long before now, but it hadn't. So Jasmine had brought the truth with her, and she had opened it, frame by frame. The lights in the hall stayed low, the screens still frozen behind them. Sasha remained standing, shoulders pulled tight, chin lifted just barely, but her silence said everything. In that moment, she wasn't an icon. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't a villain. She was just exposed. The room had barely recovered from what it witnessed. The air was still thick with disbelief. But truth, Jasmine was learning, doesn't echo in power. It collides with it. And sometimes it's power that hits back first. The letter wasn't made public right away. It didn't need to be. What mattered was where it went and who saw it first. On official stationery from the office of Michelle Obama, it was delivered directly to the Speaker of the House, hand-carried by a trusted liaison, and marked confidential, internal congressional review only. But by nightfall, 3 news networks were already quoting its contents. Someone had leaked it, and not by accident. The timing was too precise, the headlines too synchronized. Former First Lady expresses deep concern over Crockett's conduct. Obama camp accuses Congresswoman of abuse of office. The framing was immediate and unmistakably strategic. The language inside the letter was calm, formal, and devastating. It expressed deep disappointment over what it described as a breach of institutional dignity and condemned Jasmine's actions as a reckless misuse of congressional stature for personal gain. Nowhere in the 3-page letter was the word video mentioned. Not once. No denial, no rebuttal, no explanation. Instead, it leaned on a much older tactic, shifting the spotlight, reframing the event. The letter warned that Jasmine's actions had undermined the spirit of civic unity and set a dangerous precedent by using the House chamber as a stage for targeted personal attacks. It stopped short of demanding censure, but its final paragraph urged appropriate review and internal consequences. Jasmine read it twice, then a third time. She was standing alone in her office, the overhead lights off, the city glowing dim outside the tall Capitol windows. The printed copy lay flat on her desk, her fingers pressed into the margin as if she were holding it down to keep it from floating away. She wasn't surprised, not really, but the depth of the betrayal still hit like ice water. She had grown up respecting Michelle Obama, admiring her, quoting her, and now she was being named, indirectly but undeniably, as a threat to the very integrity of the institution she had fought to enter. Outside her door, staffers whispered. One had already been approached by a senior aide to the Speaker, asking if Jasmine intended to walk back any part of her remarks. Another had received a text warning that donors were extremely uncomfortable in reconsidering their alignment. The backlash was moving fast, not because what Jasmine had said was false, but because it had made people powerful enough to call it dangerous. By morning, op-eds began to trickle in. One called her a wrecking ball in a silk blazer. Another, more venomous, accused her of carving up a fellow black woman for applause. Cable anchors, one after another, took turns debating her tone, her motives, her judgment. Not the video, not the death, not the silence that came before it. Just her, just Jasmine. The system hadn't denied the evidence. It hadn't even questioned it. Instead, it did what it always did when someone stepped out of line. It turned her into the problem. Jasmine stood still for a long moment, staring at the words, weaponizing personal accusations under the guise of civic duty. That phrase echoed louder than the rest, as if telling the truth when no one else had dared to was now a form of violence. As if speaking the name of a dead man and showing what the system had erased was somehow more offensive than the silence that buried him. She didn't slam the letter. She didn't curse or pace the room. She simply folded the page in half, then again, and slipped it into her desk drawer without a word. Not out of fear, out of resolve. Because this was never going to be easy. And now it was real. The knives had come out. The machine had begun to turn. And Jasmine Crockett, now in the center of a storm she hadn't started but refused to run from, knew one thing above all. She hadn't just challenged a person, she'd challenged a system. And systems don't bleed. They retaliate. The letter was a blade, but it wasn't the last one. By sunrise, the second came not on official paper, but from a tweet. And this time it wasn't bureaucracy striking back. It was legacy. It appeared at 7:12 a.m. sharp. No fanfare, no explanation. Just 16 words sent from the verified Twitter account of Michelle Obama. My family isn't perfect, but we don't deserve to be made sacrifices in someone else's campaign for relevance. No name, no photo, no direct accusation, but no one needed context. The timing made it unmissable. The subtext made it unmistakable. And within minutes, those 16 words were everywhere. Looped on cable news banners, plastered across editorial pages, embedded in side-by-side image comparisons of Sasha's face in Jasmine's firelit speech. The media didn't ask what it meant. They asked what it should mean. And in that ambiguity, the weapon landed. Some called it grace under fire. Others called it an attack wrapped in elegance. Either way, it worked. The shift began almost immediately. Overnight, the story had been about the footage, the facts, the silence broken. Now the conversation turned. The question wasn't whether Sasha had lied, but whether Jasmine had gone too far in saying so. Across social media, the political trenches deepened. Progressive communities fractured visibly. One side hailed Jasmine as a woman brave enough to speak when silence had become complicity, calling her the voice accountability had been waiting for. But the backlash from her own side hit hardest. Critics, some with decades of activism behind them, accused her of pulling down another black woman to climb higher. Phrases like respectability warfare, black-on-black betrayal, and careerist feminism began to fill timelines and op-ed pages. Old allies grew cautious. Some went silent. Others spoke, but with caveats. On conservative networks, the narrative turned venomous. Jasmine was labeled an opportunist, a media vulture, even a cultural assassin targeting black icons for clout. Talk radio questioned her motives. Podcasts dissected her body language. Photos of her holding the manila folder were recirculated with captions like, "Ambition looks like this." And worst of all were the memes, edited clips that stripped her words of meaning and pumped them full of malice, spread not just by critics, but by those who once praised her. And still, the video remained untouched. No denial, no clarification, not a single word from Sasha or her team about what had been shown. Instead, it was Jasmine who became the subject. Not her evidence, not her intent, just her. Inside her office, Jasmine read Michelle's tweet 4 times, then once more. She didn't respond, not because she had nothing to say, but because she knew whatever she said next would not be heard as truth, only as strategy. Her staff stood quiet, not out of fear, but because they could feel it too. The tide had turned, and it hadn't turned because she was wrong. It had turned because she had touched something people didn't want disturbed. A colleague she respected, someone who had marched beside her, fundraised with her, called her sister on the House floor, texted that morning, "You should have handled it privately. We protect each other, even when they mess up." Jasmine didn't answer. She didn't need to. That text said everything. Not about justice, but about how far people would go to preserve the illusion of it. She stood at the window, watching the Capitol lawn slowly brighten with the rising sun, and felt the weight pressing harder now. Not from guilt, but from the realization that she wasn't just fighting corruption, she was fighting comfort. And comfort had more defenders than truth ever would. In that moment, the tweet wasn't just a message, it was a mirror. And what it reflected was this. The price of truth wasn't just backlash, it was isolation. The world had tried to turn her into a villain, but Jasmine never needed their applause, only a signature, a statute, and the truth. And now it was time to let the law speak. At 9:03 a.m., under the dull gray sky that blanketed Washington like a curtain before the storm, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett entered room 2141 of the Rayburn House Office Building. Not as a politician seeking attention, but as a woman holding a formal challenge to silence. Her face betrayed nothing. Her suit was navy, her heels deliberate. In her right hand was a sealed folder stamped with the House Oversight Committee's insignia. Inside, a motion that would change the rules of how power answered to truth. The request was clear, composed, and bold. Jasmine formally petitioned for a congressional investigation into the July 2022 car accident in Los Angeles, an event that, she argued, had been deliberately buried beneath a coordinated effort of bureaucratic misdirection, institutional silence, and legacy protection. As she stood before the committee panel, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The tension in the room did the speaking for her. She laid the folder on the podium with quiet finality, opened it, and read directly from the heart of her submission. This is not about political rivalry. This is about obstruction, and obstruction of justice under Title 18 of the U.S. Code is not a partisan issue. It is a federal crime. Then carefully she read the statute aloud. Whoever corruptly conceals, destroys, mutilates, or alters any record or document with the intent to impair its integrity or availability for use in an official proceeding shall be fined or imprisoned for up to 20 years. Every eye in the room locked on her. There was no theater here, no grandstanding. Only the sharp, quiet certainty of someone who had been underestimated and who now came armed with law, not opinion. Her motion named specific offices, dates, and internal actions taken in the days following the crash. It pointed to the sudden closure of LAPD's open case file. It highlighted redacted memos from the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. And most controversially, it raised the possibility that top-level figures, former public officials connected to the executive branch, may have either directly or indirectly influenced the suppression of material evidence. The room didn't explode. It didn't have to. A single breath seemed to hang in the air. She continued, "This is not speculation. This is not vengeance. This is an invitation. No, a demand for the process we claim to believe in to be tested. Because if we let silence protect the powerful, we tell every voiceless victim in this country that justice is something they are too invisible to deserve." A beat passed, then another. Then she said it. "If this body is to remain credible in the eyes of the people, then we must be willing to investigate not just those we oppose, but those we once admired." The implication hit like a gavel before any vote had even taken place. A former president of the United States could now be called to testify. Not for something he did, but for what he may have helped hide. For the machinery he may have allowed to run untouched while truth bled beneath it. By noon, the Speaker's office released a statement. They had reviewed the motion. The supporting evidence was substantial. A preliminary emergency hearing would be scheduled within the week. No names were confirmed, but the headline wrote itself: Congresswoman Crockett forces emergency hearing over alleged federal obstruction in 2022 fatal crash. Outside, the building was already surrounded by cameras. Inside, Jasmine remained in her office, surrounded by silence. Not triumphant, not shaken, just steady. She had moved the system. Now it would have to move back, or answer why it refused. The legal storm was growing, but the emotional war had already reached a boiling point. And when Sasha's voice finally surfaced, it didn't come through a press release or lawyer's statement. It came as a cry, unfiltered and devastating. The leak didn't arrive with fireworks. No press conference, no insider expose. Just a quiet drop at 2:36 a.m. An audio file, anonymously uploaded to a journalist's private channel, marked with one word: recording. At first, few believed it was real. The voice was too raw, too fragile, too unlike the public image so many had seen. But within hours, forensic analysts confirmed its authenticity. By dawn, it had been played over 100,000 times, and by noon, it was headline news. The clip was just under 90 seconds. It opened mid-breath, Sasha's voice trembling. "I didn't mean to kill anyone," she said, her words cracking as if spoken through clenched teeth. "I didn't know what to do. I just panicked." Then came the line that would be burned into every broadcast that day. "They won't care what happened. They'll just hate me because I'm Sasha Obama." There was no yelling, no screaming, just quiet crying. controlled, contained, almost like she had tried not to let herself fall apart, but failed halfway through. In the background, a second voice, presumably her mother's, could be heard murmuring something soft, unintelligible, like someone trying to comfort a drowning person from the shore. The recording cut off with a long pause. No dramatic ending, just silence. But it said more than any defense ever could. The country cracked wide open again. Some saw it as the first real glimpse of the unbearable weight Sasha had carried in silence. Commentators described the recording as a rare, unguarded moment from a woman born into impossible expectations. A few argued that it proved she wasn't cold or calculating, that she was young, scared, and suffocating under a last name too heavy for anyone to carry alone. Sympathy surged. Supporters posted stories of public shame, misjudged moments, second chances. But just as many didn't accept the tears as redemption. To others, it was a manipulation, a perfectly timed leak designed to tilt public emotion and reframe guilt as pain. On conservative outlets, pundits accused Sasha of hiding behind her family's name while playing the victim. Some voices on the left were just as sharp. "No one is saying she wanted someone to die," one activist wrote, "but someone did, and she walked away while he bled on the sidewalk. That's not trauma. That's privilege." A single tweet, retweeted over 300,000 times, summed up the rage. You don't get to cry about being hated when someone else never got the chance to be heard. Luis is dead. Sasha is trending. The contrast was brutal. Luis Alberto Mendez, the man killed that night, had no microphone, no recordings, no soft voice on tape. He had a name on a redacted report and a grieving family the country still hadn't seen. In the face of that silence, Sasha's voice, however human, however shaken, felt to many like a luxury. Inside Capitol Hill, the impact was immediate. Some lawmakers who had previously wavered in support of the investigation now called for a pause, citing emotional volatility and unfair media pressure. Others doubled down, saying the recording made the investigation more necessary than ever. "This isn't about whether she cried," Jasmine Crockett told a small circle of press later that afternoon. "This is about whether someone died and the system looked away." Jasmine didn't attack Sasha for crying. She didn't even mention the clip publicly. But those close to her said she listened to it in her office alone, just once, then closed the browser window, folded her hands, and said simply, "It's not supposed to feel easy," because the truth never did, and neither did justice. The country had heard Sasha cry behind closed doors, but now for the first time, she would have to speak in public, with the lights on, the cameras live, and the one woman who refused to let the truth die sitting 6 feet across from her. The studio was built for spectacle, but the air inside felt like a courtroom, tight, electric, breathless. CNN had branded it "The Reckoning, a National Conversation." The set was stripped of distraction, no scrolling news feed, no flashing graphics, just 2 chairs on opposite sides of a round table, harsh downlighting, and a single camera tracking both faces. Jasmine Crockett sat on the left, back straight, hands clasped. Sasha Obama sat on the right, shoulders lower, eyes darker than the public had ever seen them. There was no moderator, no crowd, just 2 microphones and 20 million people watching from across the country. For the first 3 minutes, neither of them spoke. Then Jasmine broke the silence. "This isn't easy, for either of us. But I didn't come here to make this comfortable. I came here to make it count." Her voice was even, but the edge was unmistakable. Sasha looked down, then back up. She opened her mouth once, stopped, then tried again. "I lied," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut like a blade in a silent room. "I drove the car that night." The words landed like a physical blow. Audible gasps from the control room leaked faintly into the audio feed. Sasha blinked twice, breathing through it. "I was driving, he stepped out. I didn't see him. I panicked, and I ran." Her jaw clenched. Her next words came like confession and defense all at once. "My lawyer told me to say I wasn't. He told me the video would never come out, that I should protect the family name, that admitting it would destroy everything." She paused. Her eyes flicked to the camera. Then to Jasmine. I believed him. Jasmine didn't nod, didn't flinch. She sat still, absorbing the weight of what had just been said, but her eyes remained locked, not on Sasha, but straight through the camera lens. Then she leaned forward. They told me I was a political opportunist, she said. They said I was tearing down a legacy, breaking a sisterhood, trying to destroy a family. But the person I think about every single time I speak isn't sitting at this table. Her voice cracked, not from weakness, but from something deeper, memory, purpose. The person I think about is dead, hid in silence, buried in silence, and forgotten in silence. A pause. The room felt smaller, the lights harsher. I didn't come here to watch someone cry, Jasmine said quietly. I came here to ask why someone like Luis Mendez could die without a headline, without a face, without a single person standing up, while the person who left him there gets a national stage to explain why she ran. Sasha didn't respond immediately. Her hands trembled slightly, knotted in her lap. She inhaled once, hard. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, she said, voice breaking. I didn't think I was running from a person. I thought I was running from the storm I knew would follow. You were never the one in the storm, Jasmine replied. You were the one the storm was built to protect. For a full 30 seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence felt heavier than any exchange of words. Outside, millions of viewers sat frozen, some devastated, some enraged, all witnessing something rawer than any press conference or hearing could deliver. In the background, CNN's control director gestured to cut to commercial, but the executive producer shook his head. Not yet. Sasha looked up again. So what happens now? Jasmine answered without hesitation. That depends on whether we let this moment be the end of a story or the beginning of an actual reckoning. And in that moment, with every spotlight burning hot and the full weight of two Americas colliding on one stage, neither of them blinked. The chamber was packed. A rare, full quorum on the House floor. The gallery above brimmed with journalists, lobbyists, and restless staffers, all waiting. Not for a speech, not for debate, but for a number. The vote. It had taken weeks of closed-door wrangling, hours of bitter committee clashes, and days of public outcry that refused to be silenced. The motion on the table was unprecedented. To formally open a special investigation into alleged federal obstruction surrounding the 2022 crash that killed Luis Alberto Mendez, and to determine whether political influence had suppressed accountability. The motion did not name Sasha Obama directly, but everyone in the room knew what it meant. This was no longer a political talking point. This was legal fire drawn in ink and statute. When the roll call began, the room froze. One by one, names rang out over the speakers, some crisp, others trembling, all recorded into history. Yes. No. Yes. No. On screens lining the back wall, tallies formed in real time, red and green dots ticking upward like a national pulse under pressure. At 2:18, the room tilted. At 2:25, the noise in the gallery began to shift. At 2:30, the final yes rang out, and the gavel dropped like thunder. Motion passed, 230 in favor, 205 against. The decision echoed far beyond the marble walls. Cable news erupted. Some anchors celebrated it as a long overdue reckoning. Others warned of weaponized justice and partisan persecution. But the numbers didn't care about spin. The investigation was real, authorized, funded, and for the first time in modern history, the path was now cleared for Congress to question not just civil servants, but the most protected circles of American power. Within the hour, subpoenas began rolling out. DOJ liaisons were contacted, internal records were ordered, and then the one notice that truly shifted the ground was issued. Sasha Obama was formally summoned to testify under oath. The letter arrived not by press, not by leak, but by certified courier, handed to her attorney's office with a timestamp, signature, and instruction to appear within 7 business days before the Special Oversight Subcommittee. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was simply federal, binding, unavoidable. She was no longer a bystander in a political firestorm. She was now a named participant in a legal process that would be etched into history. Inside her DC residence, Sasha received the news in silence. No cameras, no speech, just a printed copy delivered to her by her legal team. For a long time, she stared at the words without reading them aloud. Then she folded the paper in half, placed it on the table, and whispered to no one in particular, "I knew it would come to this." Outside, a different wind had begun to blow. Protesters gathered at both ends of the Capitol, some holding signs that read, "Justice delayed is justice denied," others holding portraits of Sasha from her childhood, framing her as a victim of political vengeance. But inside the committee chambers, the tone was clear. The time for emotion had passed. Now came testimony, records, evidence, timelines. The House had made its choice, not to assume guilt or innocence, but to say out loud, "This demands to be examined." And Jasmine Crockett, standing outside the rotunda that night under a low October sky, didn't smile or speak to reporters. She simply looked up, exhaled once, and said quietly to her aide, "Now they can't unhear it, now they have to look." Because now, finally, the truth had a subpoena. And it was walking through the front door. The subpoena had shaken Capitol Hill. But outside its walls, the world had already passed judgment. And what America had tried to contain as a legal dispute, the global press had named for what it truly was: a betrayal wrapped in silence. It didn't take long. Once the congressional vote went public and Sasha Obama was officially summoned to testify, the world turned its full attention to the story and gave it a name: the scandal of silence. That phrase appeared first in an op-ed from the Times of London, then spread like wildfire through the international press, crystallizing what many around the globe already felt. This wasn't just a scandal, it was an indictment of the very idea that America was still morally exceptional. El País called it an act of cowardice at the highest levels of influence. The Sydney Morning Herald referred to it as the moment the illusion of ethical legacy crumbled. In South Africa, a major paper ran the headline, "She died in the spotlight. He died in the dark." It wasn't just Sasha under scrutiny. It was every institution that had enabled her silence. In countries where power routinely shields the privileged, the story hit a nerve. In Brazil, commentators compared it to Petrobras. In France, where class immunity was a national wound, editorialists asked how a man like Luis Mendez could disappear from the narrative of the world's most powerful democracy. Tokyo's NHK offered a chilling reflection. If America cannot tell the truth when it concerns its most admired names, what chance does anyone else have? Meanwhile, Kenyan journalists, long proud of the Obama name, expressed quiet grief. One article in the Daily Nation read, "For years we celebrated the symbol. Today we mourn the silence." What shocked foreign analysts most was not the crime. It was the concealment, the paper trail of redacted memos, the closed LAPD file, the sudden disappearance of surveillance footage from public record, the absence of a single federal charge. All of it fed a growing sense that America's justice system was not only flawed, but selectively blind. And Jasmine Crockett? She became a symbol too. Not of rebellion, but of refusal. Refusal to let silence have the last word. Back in DC, Jasmine watched the coverage from her office late into the night. The floor around her was littered with folded newspapers and printed articles, her desk a collage of global reaction. Every page told her two things: the world was watching, and the weight she was carrying was now heavier than ever. Some articles praised her as a lone voice who forced a superpower to look in the mirror. Others, especially from U.S. outlets, accused her of exploiting grief for political edge. But even the worst of them could not change the fact that a man had died. And for a full year, no one in power had spoken his name. Jasmine had never intended to go global. She wasn't aiming for a movement, a legacy, or a headline. All she had wanted was accountability. What she had unearthed instead was a wound deeper than she imagined. A culture that revered transparency only until it touched the wrong last name. And in exposing that, she had made herself a target. But something had shifted, something irreversible. Now Luis Alberto Mendez, an undocumented worker, a man without a microphone, without a platform, without a famous family, was being written about in Nairobi, Paris, Seoul, and Rio. His name was no longer just a line in a forgotten report. It was a reckoning. It was a demand. It was a headline. And Jasmine Crockett had made sure the world didn't forget it. The world had watched the scandal unfold, the silence shatter, and the reckoning begin. Now all eyes turned to the courtroom, where Sasha Obama would finally confront the consequences of her actions, not as a former first daughter, but as a citizen seeking redemption. The morning air was thick with anticipation as Sasha Obama approached the courthouse steps. Dressed in a simple navy suit, devoid of any entourage or legal counsel, she exuded a solemn determination. The gathered crowd, a mix of journalists, activists, and curious onlookers, fell into a hushed silence, their cameras capturing every step of her solitary walk. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was equally tense. Spectators filled the benches, their gazes fixed on the young woman who had become the center of a national controversy. As Sasha took the stand, the room held its collective breath. She began her statement with a steady voice, acknowledging her role in the tragic accident that claimed the life of Luis Alberto Mendez. She admitted to driving the vehicle that night and to the subsequent decision to remain silent, influenced by legal advice and fear of public backlash. Her words were measured, devoid of excuses, and laced with genuine remorse. "I cannot change the past," she said, her voice wavering slightly, "but I can take responsibility for my actions and the pain they've caused." She then announced her decision to accept the court's judgment without contest, including any penalties deemed appropriate. Furthermore, she pledged to cover all expenses related to Mendez's funeral and to establish a fund supporting his family's future needs. The judge, moved by Sasha's candor and willingness to accept responsibility, sentenced her to a suspended sentence with probation, emphasizing the importance of accountability and the hope for healing. As Sasha exited the courtroom, the crowd outside remained silent, a collective acknowledgement of a chapter closing, not with vindication, but with a step toward restitution. The courtroom had borne witness to confession and consequence. But as the doors opened to the world outside, the true measure of justice lay not in the sentence delivered, but in the truths acknowledged and the paths chosen thereafter. Under the gray expanse of a solemn sky, the courthouse steps became a stage for a nation grappling with its conscience. Jasmine Crockett stood before a throng of reporters, her posture unwavering, eyes reflecting the weight of the journey that had led to this moment. The murmurs of the crowd hushed as she raised the microphone, her voice cutting through the tension with clarity and conviction. "Justice is not vengeance," she declared. "It's the restoration of truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable." Her words resonated beyond the immediate audience, echoing through the airwaves into homes and hearts across the country. This was not a victory lap. It was a solemn affirmation of accountability and the enduring pursuit of equity. Inside the building, Sasha Obama emerged, her expression a tapestry of remorse and resolve. She paused at the threshold, the weight of public scrutiny pressing upon her, yet she met it with a composed demeanor. No words were exchanged between the two women as their paths converged momentarily, but their shared glance spoke volumes, a silent acknowledgement of the painful journey they had navigated from opposing sides. They descended the steps in tandem, not as allies but as individuals bound by a shared commitment to truth. The cameras captured this poignant tableau, a visual testament to the complex interplay of justice, responsibility, and the human capacity for growth. The nation watched, breath held, as these two figures, once emblematic of division, demonstrated that confrontation, when rooted in integrity, can be a catalyst for collective introspection. Their departure from the courthouse did not signify closure, but rather the commencement of a broader dialogue on privilege, accountability, and the imperative of confronting uncomfortable truths. In that shared moment of solemnity, the country glimpsed the possibility of transformation, born not from consensus, but from the courageous act of facing the truth head-on. As the courthouse steps faded behind them and the headlines began their relentless churn, something deeper stirred beneath the noise. It wasn't just about the accident anymore. It wasn't just about Sasha or Jasmine. It was about the fault lines of justice in a nation still learning how to hold everyone, famous or forgotten, accountable. And though no handshake had been exchanged, The moment they exited together had triggered a cultural shift that no one could ignore. The silence that once protected power had been pierced, not by rage, but by relentless truth. And that truth didn't need a megaphone. It had already found its way into living rooms, courtrooms, classrooms, and dinner tables across the country. The question now wasn't who won, but what had been revealed, and whether America had the courage to listen. Because the real story, the one that mattered beyond sound bites and scandals, was about what happens when a nation is forced to look in the mirror and doesn't like what it sees. For every voice calling Jasmine a destroyer of unity, there were others, quieter perhaps, but just as fierce, who called her what she truly was, a disruptor of silence. In a country built on selective amnesia and polished narratives, her insistence on digging beneath the surface wasn't an act of aggression. It was an act of love. Love for the Constitution, love for the voiceless, love for justice that doesn't come with a PR team. And that kind of love, it's the most dangerous force in America, because it doesn't flinch. The tragedy that started this chain of events wasn't only that a life had been lost, it was that the system had quietly deemed that life expendable. A man had died, no headlines, no candlelight vigils, no calls for reform. Why? Because his name wasn't trending, because his documents weren't in order, because his family didn't have a platform. That, Jasmine knew, was the real injustice. Not that the system made mistakes, but that it only acknowledged them when someone powerful forced it to. And in doing so, the system exposed itself, not as broken, but as carefully engineered to protect those already protected. But this story wasn't just about pain, it was about purpose forged in fire. Sasha, once shielded by every institution imaginable, had finally stepped into the light. Not with lawyers, not with spin, but with a confession. That act alone did not erase what had happened, but it did something more important. It reminded the country that accountability is possible, even for those born into untouchability. And Jasmine, she reminded the nation that speaking truth to power isn't about spectacle, it's about survival. Her fight wasn't just to challenge Sasha, it was to challenge the lie that justice must always serve the comfortable. In every hallway of power, people now whispered her name differently. No longer a rising voice to be tamed, Jasmine Crockett had become a symbol of what happens when silence is no longer an option. Her words, "Justice is not revenge, it is restoration," were now being printed on posters, projected onto buildings, and repeated in classrooms. But what made those words land wasn't their poetry. It was the pain behind them, the years of being ignored, the nights she lost sleep over evidence no one wanted, the threats, the isolation, the calculated smears. And yet, she stood. Some say America learned that even its most cherished names are not above truth. Others say it learned that real courage is standing alone until others find their voice. But what Jasmine wanted it to learn was this: justice without discomfort is just decoration, and accountability without sacrifice is just theater. You cannot mourn a dead man in secret and call it justice. You cannot forgive what you refuse to face, and you cannot build unity on a foundation of silence and shadows. So here was the lesson, raw and unfiltered. Truth is inconvenient, but it is not optional. When we let legacy outweigh legality, we betray the very principles we claim to defend. When we elevate reputation above restitution, we crush those already broken. And when we silence the ones asking hard questions, we are not protecting peace. We are protecting power. Jasmine Crockett didn't come to make friends. She came to make change. And if change makes you uncomfortable, that's the point. In a country addicted to closure, this wasn't a happy ending, but it was an honest one. And perhaps that's what America needs most right now. Not another apology behind closed doors, but a reckoning in the daylight. Not a perfect resolution, but an unflinching confrontation with the truth. That is where healing begins, not with polished speeches or viral clips, but with the courage to say, we failed, but we will not hide. So when people ask what this story was really about, let it be this: it was never about destroying someone's future. It was about honoring someone's past. It was about asking the hardest question in democracy: who do we mourn publicly and who do we erase quietly? And it was about what happens when someone dares to flip that script. The body of that Honduran man was buried without fanfare, but his death echoed louder than the silence that followed. Jasmine made sure of that, and though the world may never remember his name, the nation would never forget the storm his story unleashed. Because that's what justice is. Not a verdict, not a headline, but a shift. A shift in how we listen, in how we weigh truth, in how we define who deserves to be heard. And in that final moment, as the courthouse faded behind them and the nation held its breath, two women walked forward, not as heroes or villains, but as reminders. That justice, when it's real, costs something. And sometimes the price is the comfort of pretending everything's fine. Jasmine had paid that price, and in doing so, she bought the nation something priceless, the chance to start over, louder, bolder, and no longer afraid of the truth. But as the crowd faded and the spotlight dimmed, Jasmine knew the story wasn't finished. It was only beginning. Truth had cracked the surface, but now came the harder part, turning pain into power and headlines into change. She stood at the steps of the Capitol, not for applause, not for vengeance, but for something far more dangerous: clarity. The same voice that had cut through congressional chambers and courtroom silence now echoed across the plaza with conviction sharpened by fire. "We do not get to call ourselves a free nation," Jasmine declared, "if truth is treated as a threat and silence is sold as peace." Cameras clicked. Reporters froze. But Jasmine wasn't speaking to the press. She was speaking to every family who had been erased, every immigrant buried without justice, every whistleblower punished for refusing to bow. Behind her, flags waved in the breeze, but they seemed less like symbols of pride and more like reminders of how far the country had drifted from its promises. Jasmine raised her hand, not as a politician, but as a citizen, wounded, unyielding, alive with purpose. "This is not about politics," she continued, her voice never shaking. "It is about power, and the people who have used it to protect themselves instead of the truth." She paused. "And I'm not here to make them comfortable." Her call was not gentle. It was a rupture, a demand for vigilance, for resistance, for memory. "If we let this moment pass," she warned, "we will prove that justice is nothing more than a performance we applaud before returning to silence." And in that silence, she knew the same old games would play out. Doors closed, records sealed, names protected, and the dead forgotten. "We have to break the cycle, not tomorrow, not in the next election, now." She laid out what came next, not as a request, but a blueprint for every person watching. First, a legislative overhaul of how unreported incidents involving public figures are handled. Second, mandatory federal oversight for prosecutorial discretion when undocumented victims are involved. And third, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, not just for past abuses, but for the silence that followed them. "Because cover-ups don't rot in the dark," Jasmine said, eyes narrowed. "They metastasize." Then she named it: the rot, the machine, the layers of polite protection that shield the privileged from accountability. She did not flinch as she spoke names, departments, dates, and bills, all the pieces of a system built to forget. "Don't ask why I made this public," she said. "Ask why it was ever hidden." And with that, the crowd was no longer a crowd. It was a movement. Veterans with folded flags, immigrants holding photos, students clutching books filled with stories like their own. 1,000 different faces, now united by one common truth. The system had been weaponized, not against the corrupt, but against those brave enough to speak. Jasmine stepped down. She walked among them, and that's when she stopped reading from notes. "I know what it's like," she said to a young woman in the front row, "to speak and be told you're angry, ungrateful, dangerous." The woman nodded, tearful. Jasmine continued, "But I promise you, if your voice shakes the room, you're exactly where you belong." She turned to the crowd. "Use it. Don't let them make you doubt it, because silence isn't strength, it's surrender." From there, it became more than a rally. It became a reckoning. Veterans rose to demand clearer whistleblower protections for service members reporting internal abuses. Young lawmakers pledged bipartisan support for Jasmine's proposed bill. tentatively named the Silent Truth Act. And the media? For once, they stopped asking, is she going too far? And started asking, why did no one go this far before? But Jasmine knew one speech wouldn't be enough. So she issued a challenge to Congress, to governors, to judges, and most of all, to ordinary people. Watch how they vote, she said. Watch who suddenly goes quiet. Watch who tries to bury this moment in procedural fog. Then came the final blow. And if they do, vote like your voice is the only one left, because sometimes it is. The days that followed were nothing short of electric. Hashtags became town halls. Court documents were unsealed. Families who had once whispered their grief now spoke boldly, carrying photos of sons and daughters once deemed unworthy of press coverage. Jasmine returned to Washington not with a motorcade, but with a caravan of survivors. Their presence wasn't symbolic, it was tactical. We are not here for pity, she said on the House floor. We are here for power. And power finally began to tremble. An emergency hearing was scheduled to address the Silent Truth Act. A Republican senator from Utah, once dismissive of Jasmine's tactics, reversed his stance after hearing from a Gold Star mother whose son's wrongful death had been buried in red tape. A progressive from California offered an amendment that would bar any federal agency from suppressing incident reports involving minors or marginalized communities. The momentum was real and fragile. Jasmine knew that for every step forward, there would be forces trying to shove them back into silence. So she pushed harder, called out agencies by name, exposed backdoor memos, invited journalists to ride along as she visited migrant shelters and police stations, real places with real stories that couldn't be sanitized for prime time. If you're comfortable, she told them, you're not close enough to the truth. And in that truth, a new call began to rise, not from her, but from the people. Protest signs now read, "Silence is complicity." Murals appeared in cities across the country, not of Jasmine alone, but of nameless figures drawn in shadow, reminding the public of those who still lack justice. Teachers rewrote curriculums. Faith leaders gave sermons on institutional accountability. Even a few talk show hosts, once dismissive, opened their programs by quoting her final courtroom words. Justice is not revenge. It is restoration. Still, the attacks came. Smears, editorials, threats. She's dividing the country, they said. She's weaponizing grief. Jasmine answered only once. I'm uncovering the weapons that have always been there. I'm just not pretending they're flowers. She didn't expect everyone to agree. She expected them to listen, and once they listened, to act. Start where you are, she told college students. If you're in law, demand transparency. If you're in media, stop shrinking the story. If you're in politics, choose courage over comfort. And to those not in power, you don't need a podium, you need persistence. They built this system hoping you'd give up. Don't. And that's where her call still echoes. In courtrooms being reformed, in legislative sessions now forced to debate the uncomfortable, in homes once silent now telling truths at dinner tables, in the trembling hands of a father reading a new policy written in memory of a son he lost. This was not the end of a scandal. It was the beginning of a country remembering what truth sounds like, and the beginning of millions learning that when justice whispers, sometimes all it takes is one person willing to scream. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.